Yes, I can hear you.
We cannot hear you.
Okay, 1 second. Let me see what I can
There is
do.
a reason for that. Okay, can you speak now?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yup, perfectly.
Perfect. Oh, amazing.
Okay,
I don't know
great.
what happened.
So,
This time they didn't ask for the ID.
sorry? I couldn't hear what you just said.
Pardon?
Wait, were you saying something?
Yeah, they didn't ask for the ID this time.
Okay. Well, okay, so let's begin.
Yeah.
Okay, the video just froze. Okay, it's working now. So my name is Hamza. I'm a student from FC College in Pakistan. It's an honor to have you, Professor Chomsky. We know that you're a world-renowned linguist and political commentator. So effectively, what I want to have as a conversation is that we create a certain amount of discourse within our society that's related to both political philosophy as well as at the end we'll have a tangent into linguistics as well, right? So right now, one of the issues that Pakistan is famous for in terms of what it's facing is religious extremism, particularly from radicalized Islam or politicized Islam. So you being an individual who's known for advocating secular causes as well as having an approach that's political anarchy, particularly anarcho-syndicalism, what I would ask for is that how is it that in your viewpoint an anarcho-syndicalist approach could be a response towards the religious extremism that exists within our society? How could we boil that down into political activism?
Well, moving to any form of an anarchist society is a long, complicated affair. Doesn't happen in an instant. We live in a very different kind of society. It's like trying to move from feudalism to capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't happen in a day. What one can do, in fact, is follow the suggestions of one of the leading figures in the early stages of the movement, Mikhail Bakunin, and as he put it, try to construct the germs of a future society within the present one. So, for example, if you establish a community which observes democratic participation in its organization, in its budget, and its functioning, which can be done, and in fact is done, that's a small element of an anarchist society. A worker-owned and managed enterprise is another example. And some of these, incidentally, have reached an enormous scale. So there's a huge one in the Basque Country in Spain. It doesn't call itself anarchist, but it's basically what it is. Huge conglomerate, Mondragon, with worker-owned, democratically participation inside industrial hospitals, schools, housing. It's and very successful, even in the capitalist markets. And many other things can be done like that. And out of them, you can grow an expansion to a much more free and democratic society that overcomes the slave-like worker master present society. So, for example, one thing that can be done in the United States that's even within the laws is this provision called ESOPs, ESOP, which allows workers in an industry, in an enterprise, to buy shares in the enterprise, maybe using their pension funds. If they do this to an sufficient extent, they essentially take over the company.
Mhm.
They can become the majority shareholders. They can institute workers' control. They can decide on what should be produced and so on. These things are being done to a certain extent. They don't usually call themselves anarchists, but they're
Mhm.
moving in that direction. You want to look up some of the things that are happening. There's an organization called the New Systems Project,
Mhm.
which tries to organize and integrate many efforts of this kind, cooperatives, worker-owned enterprises, localism, and so on. But it really requires a basic change in consciousness. So people today take for granted that that your life is fulfilled if you get a job, a decent job. But what's a decent job? It means that for most of your waking hours, you're a slave. You're under the control of a totalitarian institution that has more control over you than Stalin did.
Mhm.
Stalin didn't tell you when you could go to the bathroom or who you were allowed to talk to or
Mhm.
what clothes you have to wear and so on. But that's what it means to get a job. Now you look at the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, workers bitterly resented this and fought against it, regarded it as a fundamental attack on their human dignity and human rights. Over time, it just gradually came to be sort of common sense. You just accept it, but people
But
shouldn't accept it.
if I were to
And it,
intervene here and ask one question, wouldn't you say that this sort of dynamic that exists of individuals working at particular set hours, don't you think that's something that contributes to a certain amount of productivity that we need for the consuming of the goods that we have?
sorry, I didn't. Could you say it a little more slowly? I didn't hear.
Yeah. So if we are working in what you describe as slave-like conditions, do you not think that set working hours contribute to productivity which otherwise would not exist?
Not at all. More productive than a capitalist enterprise. Doesn't capitalist enterprises waste an enormous amount of time and cost and simply supervising workers, making sure they do what they are supposed to do.
Mhm.
You eliminate all of that when it's a democratic institution. When people do organize and decide what to do and then do it.
So, what do you think is basically the incentive for these capitalist enterprises to keep people working at set hours and in set ways?
Well, there is a capitalist ideology which claims that what people really want to do is they just lie and look at the sky, and they have to be forced to work somehow. But every one of us knows that that's totally false. Creative work under your own initiative is one of the greatest things in life. You just take some working guy who works in in a auto plant or something. He works like a slave all week, but on the weekend, too, he doesn't lie down, you know, do nothing. He goes into his garage and builds machines or does something else, plants a garden, does something. Maybe writes a book. People want to do something from childhood. People are basically inquisitive, creative. They want to do something that matters. That's sort of driven out of their heads in the educational system and the general cultural system. They're kind of trained that what you have to do is go to the shopping mall and see if you can buy something. But that's not the highest goal in life for a free human being. Artisans take pride in their work. They want it done right.
Mm.
If a woman in Pakistan somewhere weaves rugs, she
Mm.
wants to do it the right way,
Mm.
even if she doesn't sell them. That's not the point. You want an artistic product. That's what humans are like. So I don't think there's a problem with incentives. That's capitalist mythology.
All right. So for the common individual, if they want to bring about some sort of revolution or some sort of change of this sort that challenges the capitalist enterprise, and along with that also comes into clash with the religious ideals within a society. So how do you think that an individual ought to go about doing that and not put themselves or their family members at risk?
It depends on the society. In Pakistan, it's extremely hard
Mm,
because of the power of the religious authorities, the control, even the control of consciousness and belief by the religious authorities, not just force. And to break out of that is quite a battle.
mm,
Can't just do it overnight. It took, even to say overcome slavery took centuries. There
yeah.
was a long period of time when, in fact, most of human history, it was considered perfectly natural for there to be slaves. It was believed that there couldn't be higher civilization unless a category of people were slaves. So you go back to classical Athens or Rome, which were sort of models of free society. But what their basic belief was, it should be a free society for elites who can spend their day wandering around the agora in central Athens and debate and discuss. And meanwhile, somebody else does all the work. Otherwise, you couldn't have a legit. It took a long time to beat that out of people's heads. Now it sounds grotesque. Same
So
with what you're talking about.
if I were to draw parallels between the example that you used of slavery, right? One thing that we saw was that there was, of course, protest from those who were slaves, but there was also a certain amount of action that was taken by those who were essentially the masters or the rulers. Now, similarly, in our society, right now, we've currently got a few intellectuals or few political leaders who are, or teachers essentially, who are trying, utilizing the privilege that they have to try to create a sort of top down approach where they unite workers. Do you think that that leads to a certain amount of hijacking? That if a rich individual comes and tries to give voice to the poor, do you think that that leads to the rich essentially hijacking the struggle of the oppressed class?
Somebody who comes in and tries to give leadership to the poor.
Yeah, from privileged.
Depends how, if you come in as a, if you come in from the privileged classes, depends how you come. Do you come to participate and offer your own skills and abilities and privilege to be used by the community? Or do you come in to dictate to them what they should do and what they should believe? These are very different systems.
And what do you think is more likely to happen in such a scenario? Do you think a person from a privileged background coming to effectively lead the masses, do you think that would adopt a dictatorial sort of regimic perspective?
Can happen. That's what happened in Bolshevik Russia, for example. Look at 1917. It's a very revolutionary society. A lot of worker and peasant activism, forming Soviets, workers' councils, communities, very lively, basically democratic socialist society. After Lenin took over, it's all crushed. What turned out was just one of the most anti-socialist societies in the world. It's called socialist, but that's a joke. But it doesn't have to happen. It's possible for people to come in and participate. So, for example, there's a wonderful woman in India who I know, Aruna Roy. You might have heard of her.
Yeah.
She was a professor at the university. took off, went to live in a poor village in Rajasthan, where she's working. And I think maybe 20 years, has been living in poverty with the poor, helping them, which she can do with the skills and advantages that she has. She has become a ruler. And there are plenty of people who do that. I mean, they don't get known in history. But for example, during the US wars in Central America in the 1980s, thousands of people from ordinary American life, but many of them from church groups, went to live with the people who were under attack and to try to help them and give whatever protection a white face gives, and help them not only resist oppression, but build some kind of lives. I've watched some of it done. Nobody remembers any of their names. They don't enter history, but it makes a big difference.
So in Pakistan, one issue that we face is that obviously educational institutes have a strong role to play in developing the consciousness of our people. But the issue that we face is that when our professors try to teach critical thinking, they face two types of issues. One issue is that they encounter a student body that's radicalized, which doesn't want to accept their ideas because they think they're too free or they fall into the realm of sin. And the other issue that we face is from authorities, which do not want students to develop critical thinking in order to keep the massive body passive. An example of this was an individual known as Ahmad Ali Jan, who you also lent support to once he was thrown into jail, once he was kicked out of the university that he was teaching at, because they believed that he was somehow creating more of a haywalk rather than creating critical thinking. So how do you think educational institutes ought to go about this? Or what role do educational institutes play in general?
Know what they ought to do. What they ought to be is fostering people like that, offering opportunities, fostering creativity, independence of students, faculty, and so on. It's easy to say, hard to achieve. Those are struggles that have to be taking place. I mean, Pervez Hoodboy is an example of somebody who spent his life on this. It's not easy. There's no simple answer. It's a constant struggle.
So over here, one final question with regards to political ideology would be that we recently had a women's march, and it was something that was criticized for several reasons. One reason that it faced, or one accusation it faced, was that it's elitist, and the other one that it faced was that it's sort of, well, it was going against what they called the norms of society. So how do you think that any sort of narrative, especially within the time of social media, could be created? And do you think that Aurat March or the Women Rights March could be merged with other ideologies such as Marxism? Because a lot of their demands revolved around saying things like, we should not be taking loans from IMF. Do you think that that's the right thing to do?
There's no general answer. You have to look at the specific cases. And if a loan comes from IMF with conditionalities that require subordination of the country to foreign domination, then you don't take it. If a loan comes from, say, the World Bank to counter the growth of AIDS in the country, okay, that can be very helpful. In Africa, in fact, such loans have virtually eradicated major AIDS epidemics. So fine. If it's coming for a nefarious purpose, you don't accept it. But there can't be a general rule about these things. You have to look at each particular case, find out what's the best way, or often what's the least bad way, because often all the options are negative, but some are worse than others. And that's the world in which we live. It's always been true. It's been true of every campaign in history. Abolitionist campaigns, for example, went on for a century.
Okay, so now let's move on towards the other thing that you're famous for, which is linguistics. So you're known as the founder of the universal grammar theory, or the language acquisition device. A few questions that I had about that was, firstly, when you talk about the language acquisition device, it's moved on from there to go on towards what's known as the language acquisition support system. And could you draw a difference for us with regards to what's the difference between the two, and which one do you rely on more, or lean towards more?
What are the two?
Language acquisition device and language acquisition support system.
What's a language acquisition support system?
Well, the language acquisition device, I think the way that it was going about was that it doesn't necessarily need a lot of triggers from within society for language to develop.
But
Do you think?
these are just descriptions of different things.
Right.
The language acquisition device is not, you take a look at its definition.
Right.
It's an abstract description of what takes place in the process of language acquisition. It doesn't describe the mechanisms by which it takes place. A person isn't, I mean, if it's not what it says is that here's what happens in language acquisition. You start with an innate a system which has built-in structure. It gets data fed into it. It ends up in another state. And we can abstractly study what's the relation between those two states. The initial state before any data came in, the final state after the data came in. And you get very interesting results that way. You discover the nature of the initial state, what had to be in it. Studying by you have to take a look at the interactions between the infant and people in the environment. To what extent does the mother's voice matter? To what extent do peers matter? Things like that. But these are just different topics. One is the abstract study of what has taken place. The other is the investigation of the mechanisms by which it takes place. So there's no choice. It's one, they contribute to each other.
Okay. So another question that I have is related to the development of language in terms of its evolutionary history. So most people say that language developed for effective communication. You've been somebody who's leaned more towards saying things like that it developed for the understanding of inner thought, or for comprehending one's own thoughts. What made you draw that sort of conclusion, or become a minority in the linguistics community for holding such a view?
Well, I can't describe this in a minute. There's extensive work on the nature of language. We shows that its basic design is for expression of thought. It can be, but need not be, externalized in one or another sensory modality. It's usually speech, can just as well be sign, could even be touch. Sound has some advantages, but these are not intrinsic to the nature of language. And it turns out that when you look at it closely, whenever there's a conflict between the theory of generation of thought and communicative efficiency is always sacrificed. It's not a driving element of language. And in fact, the very design of language leads to structures that are difficult for they harm communication. It takes something as simple as ambiguity, like flying planes can be dangerous. Can mean either to fly planes or planes that fly. But that kind of thing harms communication, but it makes the theory of the language simpler. The simplest rules for expressing thought just give those results. And there are many such cases. So if you look closely at it, turns out that even externalization to a sensory modality is secondary in language, and communication even more so, because it's based on the externalization. And the belief that language evolved for communication is just a dogma that comes from the assumption that language must have evolved for animal communication systems. But that's just a religious dogma. There's no reason to believe that. All that we know about language evolution is that about 200,000 years ago, modern humans emerged, different species. And we have good evidence that language was already implanted in them. It wasn't very long after that, that in evolutionary time, like 25,000 years, was an instant in evolutionary time. But not very long after that, human groups began to separate. And in fact, they're scattered in different parts of the world with no contact with one another. They have the same language faculty, which means it must have been there before they separated. So it seems to have come about along with modern humans. And in fact, there isn't any evidence for symbolic behavior before the appearance of humans, complicated artifacts and so on. So all the evidence seems to converge in saying that when modern humans appeared, they were different from precursors. One of the differences that something changed in their brains, which implanted this system, which has properties that nothing else has. It has nothing at all to do with animal communication. That's just a misunderstanding of vulgar Darwinism.
Okay. So two last final questions. One thing is that how much of a role has Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysts in general, such as Jacques Lacan, have played in your understanding of language? Has there been any influence from these figures?
None whatsoever.
None whatsoever.
When I was your age, I was interested in psychoanalysis. I thought it was pretty interesting and exciting. The more closely I looked into it, I think there's nothing there. I mean, it may be, and apparently is, a useful therapeutic technique. I mean, I know people who have gained from working with a psychoanalyst, somebody who was able to get them to bring out things that were hidden in their own history and their own thinking. So it kind of works, that's fine. Shamans work in indigenous cultures, that's fine. But when you try to ask, is there any theoretical content behind it, I think it's very hard. There's, as I say, I was seriously interested in one time, thought it was exciting and so on, but my own view is you just can't find serious intellectual substance.
So there is this one concept of Freudian slips where you mean to say one thing, but you end up saying another. And the other thing that you say, they say reveals your inner hidden desire. So do you think that holds any weight in terms of?
That's certainly true. It's a familiar experience. So yes, there are things like that. And we can look into them and ask why we did it. But it doesn't seem to me to tell us anything much. I mean, you mentioned inner speech before.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, when you study inner speech, you find out it's not inner. It's externalized speech that we're just not making noises from. But what's going on internally is very different from what we call inner speech. And there's good evidence for that. I can't really go through it in detail here.
So one last question, which is simply that we know that you wrote an essay where you pointed out why you felt that B.F. Skinner's approach towards language is something that you didn't necessarily agree with. And one thing, B.F. Skinner's.
B.F. Skinner.
Yeah.
I thought it was totally vacuous, not
Yeah.
just that.
And you pointed out the poverty of stimulus as one example as to why you didn't agree with it, right? So could you just tell us what that is?
Poverty of stimulus is something we see in a 2-year-old child. You can demonstrate that they know a great deal that they have never experienced. I mean, you can see it even with the meaning of a simple word. You start to ask yourself, what's the real meaning of a simple word like tree or river or so on? Turns out to be very complex. No, children learn that on 1 or 2 exposures. You can't tell them anything about the meaning. So it's all junk. I mean, of course, you have to have experience tells you something. Like, I don't speak Urdu, for example, because I didn't have that experience.
Yeah.
But it turns out that the languages, say Urdu and English, are fundamentally very similar at the core. Now, you pronounce a couple things differently. You pronounce the word for tree differently. The word order is a little bit different, a few things, but at the root, when you start looking at the nature of the language, they're basically the same. And that fundamental content of language simply can't be learned. There's no evidence for it. And by now we have very detailed, careful statistical studies of the total linguistic input to a 2 or 3-year-old child. And you don't even get many cases of 2 words in sequence repeating, let alone 3 words, almost never. I mean, it's very impoverished. And what is known goes vastly beyond it. And furthermore, we're constantly, even young children are constantly creating new expressions, which are part of the language, which have maybe never been used before, certainly not in their experience. The idea that everything is just rammed home by association doesn't off the ground. And when people try to do it the way Skinner did, it totally falls apart, as you can see by just looking at the elementary example. It's still believed by many people, incidentally. So, it's not, I'm not expressing a consensus view, but since you're asking me my opinion, I think there's simply no question about it.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining me. Today was incidentally also my 21st birthday. So in a way, this was kind of like a birthday present to me. So thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Okay,
All
I've
right.
got another interview.
Okay then. Best of luck.
Talk to you.
Bye.